Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for this virtual MBA masterclass this afternoon. My name is Olivia and I'm currently an undergraduate student here at the Macquarie Business School, and I'll be hosting today's session. Now, before we get into things, we're just going to wait one more minute just to ensure that everyone has enough time to join into the meeting, and we'll start right after that. Okay, well, thank you again, everyone, for joining this afternoon's MBA Masterclass. It's great to see so many of you here virtually. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land, waters, and community. We pay our respect to them and their culture, as well as elders, past, present, and future. For those of you who have just joined us, my name is Olivia, and I'm currently an undergraduate business student here at Macquarie, and I'll be the host for today's session. So we have some great speakers lined up for you today to share their perspectives on the topic of leading through disruption. But before we introduce them, I'm just going to quickly cover some Zoom housekeeping. So today's session will be recorded. So if you feel like you've missed anything, please don't worry. The recording will be distributed to you after the event, and it will also be available on our YouTube page in the coming weeks. Cameras and microphones for participants have also been turned off today just to maximise the webinar experience. We do, however, encourage you to ask any questions that you may have throughout the session, and you can do this via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll be addressing any questions that you have at the end after today's panel discussion. So now I think it's time to get to introducing our panel. So first up, we have Associate Professor Steve James, who is actually the Program Director of the MBA here at Macquarie. So Steve has over 20 years experience in research, teaching and executive development, as well as consulting in the fields of business strategy, leadership, culture and change. So I'm now going to pass it on to Steve to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you very much, Olivia, and welcome again to this Macquarie MBA Masterclass and information session. And yeah, we hope to see you, Olivia, on the MBA in due course as well, once you get through the undergrad and get some work experience following that. Our topic tonight is on leading through disruption, and we are going through, as we all acutely know, a pandemic which continues to impact us in significant ways. So really our focus here is on how do you lead through this context, through this turbulent environment. What are the relevant skills and practices that will help you through here, that are enduring in the sense that will inform your conduct, how you communicate, how you interact with others, to help get through this very challenging time, impacting some industries a lot more than others, actually providing opportunities for some industries. So to that end, I'm delighted to welcome along with us tonight three of our alumni that have led at different stages of their career, but led very strong careers since completing their MBAs. So firstly, we have Clint McKellar, the Director of Finance at Morgan Stanley. Clint is currently based in Mumbai, has strong leadership experience in finance, project management, sales and marketing, and has a particular interest, I think, in terms of purpose around diversity and inclusion and how he can bring that to Morgan Stanley. So I think Clint has a particular interest and drive in that area there. So welcome, Clint. We're also joined by Kristen Harris, the Head of Global Sales at SIFT, which is a software as a service company focusing on data management, data intelligence and artificial intelligence in terms of the use of data. We know that is a big focus in industry. Kristen is fresh out of the MBA, having finished in 2020. Clint, going back to Clint, he finished back in 2012, so it's 8 years on. Kristen is just out of the MBA and fresh into this role at SIFT with a strong experience in leadership across sales, finance, and also with building partnerships, strategic partnerships. So welcome, Kristen, to our session tonight. And I'd also like to welcome Steve Schofield, who finished his MBA back in 1997. So that's 24 years ago. So has matured well, I'm sure, since then. And Steve has a strong focus in the HR field, has taken up a number of increasingly senior positions in that field, and is currently the group head of Human Resources and Industrial Relations at the Downer Group. So welcome to you all, and very grateful that you've joined us tonight to share your experiences, to connect back to your MBA, and to really illustrate how you've travelled in your career during and since the MBA. So back to you, Olivia, just to commence our panel session.
Great, thank you so much, Steve. So I know that we've just been given a brief overview about you all, but it would be great if you could all share a little bit more about your background and what your current role is. And I might give this one to you, Kristen, to start us off with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Olivia. So my background has been quite an interesting one in the perspective that I didn't really take a focused approach to where I am today. It's more of one that's evolved over time, and by being open to different challenges and opportunities as they've presented themselves. My background for the last 14 years has been in the software as a service sector, so the SaaS space. And I've really enjoyed the opportunities that have been presented in the myriad of roles that have come my way. And as mentioned before, that has been through different roles such as finance, sales, business development, strategic partnerships, general management of an Australian startup that is hugely successful today and has gone in the last 10, 11 years to being a significant global player. And where I am right now, as mentioned, is I've just recently joined a fresh new Australian startup in the space, which is diving into the AI space, which is, again, super exciting, full of its own challenges and opportunities. So that's a little bit about me.
Amazing. I definitely bet that space would be really interesting year on year to see the growth in it. Clint, I'll pass on to you.
Thanks, Olivia. And that's a hard act to follow when you go to banking straight after some entrepreneurial open space. So I hope I don't bore you all too much, but basically my background is anchored in finance and economics. After that, I sort of moved from the government space, where I sharpened all of my writing skills in that area, to managing large public budgets in the public health space. So I've had some exposure to sort of public health as well in Australia. I really enjoyed that healthcare space, the industry. It had its challenges. And so straight after my MBA, I went to the neuroscience marketing role with a pharmaceuticals company. So it was a completely different change from that finance and economics field that I was so sure I was going to see myself throughout the whole career. And then took over a sales and marketing team with a device company as well, working in the bariatric space, head and neck. I've also been a co-founder of a consulting firm based in the UK that specialises in working with tech and F&B industry around launch plans, concept development, and that introduction of change management processes. And then I do a full circle back into the finance sector, which takes me back to this Mumbai role here. Basically, my role here is to execute all of the business requirements that we fulfill in terms of the firm's responsibilities to our global clients, our internal stakeholders, and our worldwide operating committee, governments and regulators. It's quite a mouthful, but essentially we're the eyes and ears, I suppose, that are operating out of India for the Morgan Stanley firm around the globe. Today in my life is all around communications and project management, managing headcounts, and in the implementation of the firm's global business plan from a GIC, global in-house perspective. So that's me.
Wow, also a mixed bag of experience there. Steve Schofield, if you want to share.
Yeah, thank you, Olivia. And you're right, Clint, both you and Kristen set me up to, it's a huge hurdle to get over the top of some of those things that you're both doing, but I'll give it a go. If I think back to the time when I commenced the MBA in 1995, I was spending time in abattoirs across New South Wales learning to do the industrial relations craft and working through problem solving, and again, country areas in an industry that was certainly facing consolidation and facing some real challenge. It was quite difficult. But commencing the MBA, I then spent some time in the Navy as a civilian, working at the Maritime Command for Chris Barry, who was the Chief of Staff at the time, went on to become Chief of Defence Force. And Chris was very supportive and encouraging with me through the MBA, particularly the Macquarie MBA. And so with that MGSM experience, that then led to me having an opportunity to join Qantas, where I spent the next 9 years. And within a couple of years of joining the Qantas organisation, I was appointed to the Global Head of Industrial Relations. And again, there were some really interesting challenges, a pandemic, which was called SARS at the time. There were a number of other impacts to the airline industry through that window. But certainly, again, the HR and IR role became an area for me which really made application for what I'd done through the MBA. But since then, I've worked in different organisations, from FMCG to construction and heavy mining. But the role within Downer as Group Head of Human Resources and Industrial Relations, we have 300 sites. We've got north of 55,000 employees. We're a $14 billion a year business, so just short of $300 million a week. We currently have 5,500 vacancies on various job boards. And when we get to some of the challenges, I guess trying to set up where I might take some of that, but certainly looking forward to Kristen and Clint's contributions. I'm sure there's a lot that I can take away for my business.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot that I can take away from all of you. Steve, James, did you want to contribute? You're on mute, Steve.
Thank you, Olivia. Yes, I think I'll be learning equally as well. I mean, my work in terms of I teach on the MBA program, business strategy, and also consult in the field. So consulting to New South Wales Health. So I'm familiar with some of those sorts of issues, Clint, that you touched on in terms of the stakeholder mapping and all the complexities of working in the public sector. Also occurs to me at the moment that a company like Atlassian, one of our great companies that came out of Sydney, listed in the USA, is actually doing well through COVID in the sense of providing some of its products for free and also grabbing talent that's available in the labour market now, given that some industries have really been affected negatively. So, there's an example in this context of a company that's going on the front foot and from a strategic perspective, repositioning today for future growth and profitability tomorrow. So great example there at Atlassian, and they also do great work in terms of sustainability and ESG. So that might be a theme that comes through tonight as well. So yeah, back to you, Olivia.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for sharing. You definitely have some really fascinating work and life experience. Now I'm going to dive straight into today's topic. So we know that as the world braces itself for an uncertain future brought about by the global pandemic, our leaders are really in a position where they have to shake things up and lead through disruptions. So could you please share some of the disruptions that you are facing within your respective industries? I might start with you, Clint, for this one.
Sure, thanks, Olivia. Well, look, I think generally speaking, in a business context, life is always uncertain. I guess in terms of, the current situation, that's exacerbated, I think, by the human scale of what's going on. And so I think if I jump directly to that, I think that would be primarily the most impactful thing that we're dealing with on a daily basis, particularly here in India. It's the human disruption associated with that. We have our business continuity plans, which obviously enact straight away to ensure that the business, in terms of what their shareholders are expecting, because ultimately they're the ones that do employ us, are receiving what they need to be doing, and I guess comfortable that we're in control. But just in terms of my workforce here, those disruptions go everywhere from, virtually onboarding a whole new team around we just took on a load of new functions out of the New York office. Onboarding that team virtually, we've not met face to face. We can't really test their mettle against the criteria that we would normally do. So there's a lot of risk involved, but also, a lot of hand holding, which I think, in terms of what's required is the right thing to do. People are home-based. They're not used to working in homes. Here in India, the infrastructure is not as it is in the West. So we've got infrastructure issues as well. A lot of people don't have home PCs, home laptops. So there was a huge movement to go out to market to procure the equipment that we required. And then also, we've got to deliver these training development requirements for promotion. People are still doing the work and they're still delivering for us, and they really should be rewarded in that same vein. So we have to look at online versions of training and development where normally we'd be delivering that face-to-face. Then you've also got the emotional toll on our workforce as well. There is digital drain and overload. I see that daily. They're in close quarters here, working usually in multi-generational homes. It's a very different approach that I would be taking if I was back in London, for example. And so in terms of that disruption, that impacts on my ability as well. So there are disruptions that I've got to deal with because I simply don't have all those skills. I've not been exposed to a market like this before. So whilst I'm onboarding a lot of the team, I'm also going through that same onboarding process myself.
Yeah. And Steve Schofield, with your experience in HR, I imagine you have something similar to add on that note.
Oh, look, again, Clint's summary in terms of the impact on people, because it's not a work-related problem that we've needed to overcome. It's one of those things that's impacted so many different elements of people's lives. But look, from our perspective, we, because of the uncertainty as this process emerged and sort of built in intensity at the beginning of last year, we adopted a stance, I guess, of just trying to make sure we created a sense of calm through the organisation. We incrementally sort of worked through the health risks to our employees, and to Clint's point, the business continuity programs were activated right across the organisation. Now, we have, at the time, laundries, mining services, we were running buses and trains, we were doing construction, we were servicing, the hospitality industry essentially stopped overnight. We were required to stand down, north of 10,000 people across sort of 48 hours. We didn't qualify for various subsidies, and so we immediately enacted, the executive contributed 40% of their salary into a hardship fund so that we had something to help our casual labour that was stood down. But that sense of wanting to work with people, but still, to your point, Clint, be able to function and have those traditional business processes continue, it was a huge challenge. For us, the notion of people working from home in that sort of traditional office-based context, far less complex than what you faced in India, Clint, but we had to ensure that it's one thing, it's very easy to say we're going to have people work flexibly and work from home, but in terms of making sure that their home setup was safe, that they weren't putting themselves at risk, they had the right equipment. It was an enormous task, but very proud of the work the team did. But for me, and look, this is sort of well over 12 months into the process, the COVID piece has also offered a number of extraordinary opportunities in this HR piece, because over the course of the last 12 months, we've had various models of, I guess, what's best summarised as hybrid work arrangements, flexible work arrangements. We've now got 12 months data that shows, in general, performance has held up. There have been real challenges, Clint, here in Australia as well, about that sense of connectivity. And I'm sure, Kristen, you may have similar experiences that, working remotely over a long and prolonged period of time, people want to reconnect. And in fact, our services and the support that we've provided to people through our EAP processes have certainly been a key partner in making sure we maintain that connection. But again, whilst there's a way to go, and there's no sort of known end date to the impact of the pandemic, there are some other emerging issues, and in terms of getting people back to work, getting that right balance. There's some financial and economic issues for individuals that haven't had to pay for petrol and tolls and haven't had to buy their lunch. And if you assume that people have adjusted their standard of living by $100 to $150 a week, bringing them back to work, there's a consequence. So we've got to work through a range of those things and make sure we get that balance right, because the economy seems to have forgotten what happened in 2020, and it's sort of tearing off at a rate that we're struggling to keep up in some respects. So for us, awfully traumatic, very, very challenging. but maintaining that sense of being in as control as best we could, making sure we maintain connections with people. But now we're just working through that process to re-establish what the new normal looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think maintaining that calm and those connections is so important.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you want to share some of the disruptions that face your industry?
For me, wow, well, look, as I said, we've got 5,500 vacancies. We've got an iron ore boom in the west. We've got labour where we would normally source labour from various locations, not just within Australia, but the border restrictions have certainly made an impact there. You might spend 12 months bidding for a project, and of course, once you win a project, you've got to make sure you've got the labour. So mobilising resources across the country, the border limitations, but at the state government level, that's had some impact. But fundamentally, our work has sustained. Our biggest impact from an organisation perspective has been in that hospitality space. So simply entertainment, events, sports. There's been some return over the course of the last few months, but it's impacted thousands and thousands of people. So that disruption and supporting those people into new opportunities has been a real focus for us.
Definitely. Kristen, I'll pass on to you.
Yeah, my experience has got a lot of similarities, but a lot of differences due to the different space that I operate in. As a software as a service, being a subscription-based offering that you're putting out there, it's been an interesting journey throughout 2020 and to now to see how people have reacted to that, because retention of customers is a significant challenge for businesses like mine. Acquiring new customers can be very challenging because it really centers on that business looking at its own viability. So they're cost cutting, they're looking to nip and tuck where they can. Quite often subscriptions are the first thing that goes, following employees and so forth. As mentioned, the hospitality industry was hit hard. One of the businesses that I worked in during this time sold to a lot of, customer-orientated businesses. But fortunately, we saw a lot of initial reactions, halfway through 2020 really calmed down and a lot of business really steady. And that was really due to another disruptive factor that came out of it, and that was the necessity to innovate for those businesses. So we saw a lot of those businesses really pivot, turn themselves around, restructure their offerings or their services, and find new ways to do business, which enabled our business to continue and, in fact, made our business more and more essential. And both the business I was in, which was a reporting application before this one, and now this one being an AI product, which is really centered on helping businesses do that digital transformation and use the data that they're getting the most to the best effective way that they can. So watching businesses go through that pivot, have that transformation impacted us, but also enabled us to look at the way that we engaged with those customers, how we innovated our product, how we, more importantly, innovated the way we engaged with the customers. That was a significant challenge because as people relocated, they weren't at their office. You can't call people. You're suddenly then swept into the noise of email, which is a very busy space, which is very hard to get cut through. So yeah, quite different challenges to the ones that have been presented, but quite significant ones.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, every industry had their own unique challenges during COVID. Now, we're going to jump to the next question, and it's another big one to follow that up. And that is, in your opinion, what role should leaders play now, and what strategies could they deploy to try and get ahead of this curve? And I'll actually start with you, Steve Janes.
Well, thank you, Olivia. And just in terms, if I can just quickly just summarise, I think from Kristen, Clint and Steve, I like that reference to calm and connected. Maybe there's a theme there, but also the shifting impact on your business model and on your value proposition. So to your question there, Olivia, it's really having to rethink what you do and how you deliver it through different supply chain logistics, the move to the digital, increasing move to the digital economy. So COVID-19's really compressed that shift. It's really brought us 18 months out, has brought it to today. That there's a 3 horizons model that some of you might be familiar with in terms of today, you need to act for your core products and services. Today, you need to act for what's coming in the next 3 years. And today you need to act for what might be coming in 5 years out. That's that 3 horizons. Not sure whether you got that covered in your MBA curriculums at the time that you went through, Kristen, Clint and Steve, but that's really been brought to realization with COVID-19. So if you don't have a digital strategy, they say now for many organizations, you just don't have a strategy. So that's been a rapid adaptation. In terms of the Macquarie MBA, we've had to rapidly move last year to online delivery. And fortunately, we've been able to do that, unlike if you're in the airline industry or if you're in leisure, hospitality, you've been virtually shut down. So we've had to move rapidly to online. We're now moving back to hybrid delivery, which is face-to-face and online, and moving back fully to face-to-face, because that's really that's the DNA of the Macquarie MBA, is that face-to-face interaction, those connections that you form as you go through. And if I can just step more into that, we're focusing that now increasingly on you as a student in the MBA. Where are you at in terms of your work and career stage? And we're bringing career activity inside the curriculum in managing people, which is a development of a unit, organizational behavior, in leadership practice and in the capstone. So that's kind of a recognition of the importance of you as an individual, so that we're less discipline and content driven and more working at the intersection of where you are and what your needs are, and bringing the curriculum to you and getting that relationship built. So I think that kind of broadly links to what's happening in our wider environment. And I like those comments that the three of you made. And I was looking to see what are the underlying themes. And I think it's that connection, and it's the EQ, perhaps more so recently in these times than the IQ, because it's we've got so much urgency and turbulence around us. So it's getting that connection and that calmness inside the organization that I think is that's sort of the lifeblood that keeps us going and builds and retains that key culture in the workplace. So that's a broad range of points, Olivia. Hopefully that made sense, but back to you.
No, it definitely made sense. Clint, did you want to share, your perspectives or opinions on the role of leaders now?
Yeah, thanks, Olivia. And I completely agree, Steve. I think that whole process of continuity with an essence of calm is really what us as leaders are there to do, not just during a global pandemic, but all the time. And so for me, when I'm looking at the way that I conduct myself currently, I don't think it's a lot different to how I would hopefully conduct myself at any other time. I think, potentially what is different, however, is the urgency around pivoting as quick. And I think this global pandemic has almost been, I won't use the term a breath of fresh air, because I guess that's a wrong pun to use. But essentially, it's given us now that time. We've been forced to make critical decisions that really we should have made many years ago, and we weren't as prepared as as we should have been. So for me, I think, a leader, if I'm looking at my role now, I break it down into nouns. For me, it makes it a lot easier to sort of decipher which hats I need to be using. And currently, I need to be a performer as a leader. And as a performer, you communicate essentially to your audience consistently. You're conveying different types of messages at different times. So for me, I need to perform consistently and every other day, basically. I'm an analyst, and an analyst role is basically to decipher huge amounts of information and disseminate that with simplicity. And it goes back to that sense of calm. And finally, I think, I need to be an ally. And, I think that comes back into that EQ space where you need to be empathetic to, what's happening. And although your business continuity plans are enacted, they will inevitably you will need to make some critical decisions on what is not critical to business today. And you need to give people that space. So I could go on and on and on with, the buzzwords around, that then moves into sort of that objective space where you become a teacher and a student at the same time. You become the driver and the passenger. It really becomes a learning and a teaching opportunity. And that's where I think my leadership here has really started to recognise, where it's not my technical skills that are really required at this point. And I think that in the past, I've probably thought differently. So it's been a huge point of reflection as a professional as well, as to what is leadership, and you know, hopefully, you know, I can indemnify that as we go forward.
Definitely. Now, Steve Schofield, I'm going to ask you to start us off with this next question, because I'm sure that you can provide a valuable HR perspective in regard to what are the enduring bodies of knowledge and the skill sets that remain relevant and vital to lead and manage through times of significant change.
Yeah, look, thanks, Olivia. I guess I'd like to answer that question this way. Our businesses were performing and generally sort of achieving expectations up to the pandemic. So in terms of the strategic settings of the organisation, we needed to, through that process of maintaining a sense of cool heads and calm through that transition for the first part of last year, understand where we were at risk, understand where we were needing to adapt, to your point, Clint, pivot and maintain, I guess, business performance. For me, I mean, look, we often hear different expressions that sort of give you a sense of how you might frame your thinking. And I do think back to my time at MGSM, these were things that we discussed, and particularly that issue of being able to think on your feet and be flexible. But that expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast, I think comes to mind. But right now, a bias for action, and Clint and Kristen, you both, and Steve, you've reinforced that point, being able to make decisions quickly and being prepared to fail quickly, but, you know, accepting the fact that while you'd love more time and enjoy the assurance that you've done all you can, and in HR, we can make things really complicated for managers to make decisions, but in times like this, it's that bias for action that will determine the difference between those who will see success sooner as we come through the pandemic. So for me, one way to deal with that, to come back to your question, Olivia, is focus on retention as opposed to attraction. I think there's a lot of debate around what businesses want to be seen by for those that don't currently work for us. But for me, that emphasis on retention, be prepared to take risks and appoint people to jobs that perhaps aren't quite ready. Provide the right scaffolding and support and mentoring arrangements around them. You know, look through that ESG lens. Make sure you're perhaps taking a different perspective on how you might see a business being run into the future. To your point, Steve, that 1, 3, 5 year window, set the business up to be different, to be better across those landscapes. But for me, a bias for action. Not lose sight of the fact that the strategy and the processes you had in place up to the pandemic were arguably the best you had in mind and the best that were for the business, and not to panic. You know, again, cool heads is critical. Rely on the business settings that you had and the strategic settings you had in 2019, early 20, but be prepared to act and retain those critical talents in the business.
Yeah, and Kristen, do you have any more to add on the skill sets or the skills that you need to, you know, remain valuable and keep up to date in this time?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what everybody said, so I'll take a slightly different approach. And I think it doesn't matter where you sit in the hierarchy of your organisation, it's really important from a strategy perspective of skill set, I'll take it from that angle, to know how to manage up and manage down, manage out and manage in, if you like. So, you know, working on that, I think, is really important. And I think if leaders take charge and a sense of responsibility around encouraging their employees and their teams to do that, it's only going to foster success. It's going to foster, you know, to Steve's point, culture in the business, because that is super important. It then provides an opportunity for trust to flourish, and then truly that test and iterate environment can really start to show some dividends and pay some dividends. I think it's really important to do that test and iterate, to flex. But as long as you're keeping that in line, obviously, with the overall business strategies, and that starts to provide an area and a feeling of safety for people. But that's obviously got to be supported by a really good level of communication and collaboration. But, you know, if I head down those paths, I'm kind of going to repeat the pearls of wisdom that have already been shared, so I won't do that.
That's fine. That was great. Thank you so much. Now, we have a question specifically about the MBA. So for Steve Janes, not to get the two Steves confused, but how are our MBAs adapting to keep up with new industry and workplace demand? And how do they develop our ability to engage in faster decision-making, as been mentioned today, and cut through difficult challenges?
Thanks, Olivia. There's at least a couple of ways in the Macquarie MBA that we've worked on, in particular last year, and we're now in implementation this year. So one particular change we've brought in is to develop the focus on, as I said earlier, I jumped ahead a bit, the focus on you as an individual as you go through the MBA. So where are you? What are your needs? What are your skill gaps? How are you looking to position and reposition yourself in your existing organization or industry? Or are we looking to go across to a different industry? So that's about understanding your sense of individual purpose. I mean, purpose is getting a lot of currency these days at an organizational level, but also what's your individual sense of purpose? And we're working on you with that inside the curriculum. So we have a career coaching program located inside the curriculum and also with activities alongside it. We launched the Career Connect series last night, for example. So that's to get you to think about just where you are individually, to sharpen your understanding, to build your sense of leadership purpose, if you like, as well. Understand your strengths and to use the MBA to help you, connect with others around you in the program, because it's often through others that you learn about yourself. It's hard to figure out who you are on your own. It's by sharing and connecting with others. So we've got a program in place now working on that. The other major development, Olivia, is through the curriculum itself. So we've just brought in digital strategy for business. We might need to get you, Kristen, in as a guest speaker on that program. And that really reflects that digital transformation in industry. How do you capture and create value in terms of digital technologies, in terms of data, in terms of your ecosystem, in terms of your platform. So we have a unit focused on that, together with a unit on big data and decision making. So we've got that happening. We've brought in a leadership practice unit, which again gets you to think about your individual strengths and weaknesses and how you can build those as well. And we're developing our capstone unit to make it increasingly industry connected. So bringing in people like the wonderful alumni you see before you now as guest speakers in a formal way, not just a one-off guest speaker hit, but actually built into the program. And coming in on a regular basis as part of the curriculum. And that just builds that connection to alumni and to industry. So I think those are the main ways, Olivia, that we are building the MBA to reflect the need for skills and the trends in industry.
No, that's great. It's really good to see how responsive Macquarie is in light of, everything that's changing in our world. And that's something that I also feel at the undergraduate level as well, which is great. Now, being on the panel with so many alumni today, I have to ask, what is the most valuable thing that you took from your time during the MBA at Macquarie, and how have you or how do you apply this to evolve your thinking and leadership? I might start with Kristen.
Sure. So I went into the MBA with the intent to develop my leadership and strategic thinking skills, which I did, and that was great. So, but I think I'd call out one of the areas that I developed that I didn't anticipate developing. I've already thought that I was quite good at communicating and working with people in an environment, but anybody who's been to uni and worked in group environments knows this is quite challenging. The MBA brings that to a new level, I felt, and as much as it can be challenging, it's super rewarding. So I actually found that to be very, very useful. And there's many times in my work environment post the MBA that I reflect on some of the learning, some of the challenges, and then some of the successes that I got out of that environment of working with people with deadlines, which is no different to a working environment. You've got high pressure stakes. Quite often you've got targets to hit and so forth. Not quite the same as getting marks, but when you're driven and you want to succeed, they're like for like. And it actually, I learned a lot of skills, interpersonal skills, which I think are really essential. And only this kind of environment can really teach you. So that's something that I would call out, apart from all of the academic advancements that you make.
Definitely. Clint, did you want to share?
Yeah, I really like that because I guess it's similar in the same way that, you know, I being a finance background, economics, my thought process was very transactional, and it was really easy for me to then choose an MBA because I really looked at it in a transactional way at the beginning. You know, it was that whole payoff of I pay to get an MBA, I get paid more at the end of the MBA. So that was the transactional thought process that I really had in mind. And I went in, and after the first 3 months, I went in thinking that I knew so much about my industry and my leadership skills. And after 3 months, I realized I really knew nothing. And so the MBA really challenged me to transform my own way of thinking about myself, but also about what I thought my career path was going to be. And some of that payoff has happened for many of my alumni, and some of them decided to completely go different paths into entrepreneurial endeavors that some have done well, some haven't. But I guess that was that whole transformation of, you know, what you think your career path is going to be. You really go in thinking one thing and you come out thinking another. So that was one of the really valuable pieces for the MBA that I came across. Now, in terms of sort of applying how I think now, I'm no longer thinking that transactional way. And I think you saw me earlier today, I sort of break things down into nouns now. And as a finance expert, people just look at me like I'm a crazy person on the floor. So I think you sort of, for me, that's the whole beauty of an MBA. You get all of those group work scenarios and you get the brilliant content coming, but it's delivered in a way that challenges you. And you come out making the MBA completely different to what you went in thinking it was going to be.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you both had that experience of going in expecting something else, but it was a good thing on the other side of that. So we seem to be going backwards in terms of the years that you completed the MBA. So Steve Schofield, did you want to share your input?
Yeah, look, great share from Kristen and Clint. Look, I was convinced in that group work that the lecturers would sit back in the evenings and conspire and assemble these groups to make it as challenging as they possibly could. I think that expression, we really appreciate effort, but we're going to recognise results. To Kristen's point, you just hit hurdles. It's just that wonderful, delicious nature of people and complexity of putting different people together and needing to find a way quickly to produce a product that you know you feel you've contributed to and you've hit the mark. But look, for me, it's a great metaphor in the HR space or in the people space, where you know you choose businesses and you sort of to Kristen's earlier point, you don't always have that foresight to know that you're navigating the right direction. So there is some. I would urge people to take some comfort that it's actually okay not to know where you're going to finish up and not to have too much certainty. I think that creates that sense of angst where, you know, you need to work and contribute and you need to trust. I think you said that earlier, Kristen, and I think you said that too, Clint, that if you can trust that the scaffolding or the structure around you will recognise and acknowledge your contribution, that's really important. But look, very, very similar experience to both Kristen and Clint, and it made an enormous difference. When I started the MBA, I'd just sort of come off the back of trawling around abattoirs in remote parts of New South Wales, spent some time in the Navy. If I hadn't have done the MBA, there's no way I would have got the job at Qantas. And then, as I say, 5 years later, heading up that function, when I started the MBA, I was just hoping to get out of abattoirs, right? So that the way you think, the way you structure and the way you problem solve made an enormous difference. MGSM made an enormous difference for me.
That's really great.
Cool. Yeah.
Now we are going to jump into some of the live Q&A questions that we've been asked throughout the session. Looks like there's about one for each of you. So I'll start off with you, Clint. I'm going to try and mix two questions together here. So someone wants some insight on students trying to start a career in corporate finance, and you know, why did you make the decision to pursue an MBA rather than, let's say, a Master of Finance, and what are some of the skills that you developed in that field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think if we go back to my previous sort of process of thinking, I did think that I would go into corporate finance, into sort of that master of finance realm. It was the transition from, it was opportunistic when I was working down in Canberra. I was put onto a project to look at the financial structure of a shared services model for the Department of Treasury, and that sort of opened different doors and sort of ways of thinking. So it was really opportunistic at that point that I moved to the public health sphere in New South Wales. And at that point in time, the evolution of your career really starts to take its own path. So for me, looking back in hindsight, I don't know that I was really committed to being a hardcore banker. Being on the floor and trading, I liked the dividends that it would provide me, but in terms of what I needed from a role in the career, really started to unravel once I got into these different spaces around general management and people engagement and project management. So that was why I didn't take a master's in finance. The MBA was far better suited to somebody that wanted to really, like me, explore different disciplines but still maintain a really strategic path in terms of finance, if that's where I wanted to go. Because the exposure to those disciplines meant that I felt that then I could go slip like I have back into finance, back into corporate banking, back into an investment bank that manages over $3 trillion worth of products around the world. But I've got a very different career to those guys that are on the floor now. But I'm still in a space that I really enjoy. So for me, that was the beauty of this MBA, that it didn't narrow my field in terms of industry. It broadened the roles that was applicable to me within the industry that I chose.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, Steve Schofield, question for you. What are the most desired skills for leadership roles asked by employers?
Most desired leadership skills in terms of people who've had leadership experience, or in order to get into a leadership role?
Probably in order to get into a leadership role.
Yeah, look, couple of things. I've had some pretty ordinary jobs over the course of my career, but one of the things that, in my own experience, and certainly something that I think the literature shows, that where you can get an opportunity to manage others or have an opportunity to be responsible for others' work and be accountable for their performance and support them to sort of deliver their results, that's great experience. It's one thing, I think the structure and the nature of the flexibility of the MGSM MBA helped me appreciate that you can shape and pursue and assemble, if you like, your own pathway, which suits the specific circumstances of the job that you're doing at the time. But for me, if you've taken on board the time to appreciate contemporary learnings, research and understand, I guess, that philosophy of leadership, the Foundations program with Macquarie, I don't think anybody can come through the Macquarie or the MGSM MBA without sort of reflecting on the Foundations course. It really stretches your perspective and sort of expands your tolerance for appreciation for how leaders and how leadership has evolved. But for me, a key thing would be, if you have the opportunity to take a job where you're managing other people, get on board and do that. It may not be the best job, it may not fit, as I say, that anticipated trajectory that you may set for yourself. But if you get the opportunity to manage others, that's a key thing. Putting leadership into practice is a very, very, it will put you ahead of others at interviews and to demonstrate that you can deliver on what we need you to do as a leader.
Great, thank you. Now, Kristen, question for you. It's a little bit specific, so I'm just going to read it out. Hi, Kristen. I'm also working in a SaaS company, and I found it harder and harder to acquire leads and increase our presence online because the online marketplace looks 10 times bigger and is more competitive than ever. Just curious how you lead through this and still manage to drive sales.
It's a good question and not an easy one to answer. I would say, if we go back to that test and iterate, discussion that we had earlier, I think that is really important. I think that if you're in a position to do that, you should continue to do that, make your decisions based around the data, what it's showing you. But in order to do that, you really need to be clear about what it is that you're measuring. So try and be very clear around that and break it down. Encourage your team and your leadership team to embrace, because it's very hard to bring about test and and iteration if you don't have buy-in from internal stakeholders. So try and encourage that. And if you need to sell that internally, do some research. There's plenty online around companies that you have done that and have seen success. And I think overarchingly, when it comes to selling to individuals or trying to win, acquire new business, you really need to, it's a very overused term, but it's overused for a good reason. You really need to take a customer-centric approach. So you really need to look at it not from what you're doing. So, you know, in a sales role, the salesperson doesn't really care about, you know, the customer doesn't really care about you, doesn't really care about your software. It cares about the benefit it's going to bring. So think always in terms of, if you were the customer, would you buy from you? Why not? Would you sign up for this? Why and why not? And try and hone in on that. And I think that's applicable outside of software. I think it's applicable to any business. That's the way I'd answer that question. Hopefully that was helpful.
Definitely. Thank you so much. You broke that down for me, at least. So we've got another question. Steve Janes, I'll direct this to you first off. So someone has been thinking about an MBA for quite a while. They've worked in both big corporations and mid-sized businesses. And they want you to share some thoughts on how an MBA works in terms of career uplift and changing the trajectory of your career.
Yeah, good question. Thanks, Olivia, for relaying that. Look, I think an MBA helps, and you see this illustrated tonight with our alumni here. It helps in terms of getting you to that strategic level of thinking. So, Kristen, you just mentioned the concept I use, which is outside-in thinking. So understand your customer, be your customer. What are the critical success factors from the industry, from your customers back to you? So don't think inside out, think outside in. And an MBA helps you there. It helps you get up on the balcony as well as on the dance floor. And I think, Clint, you spoke to that. You need to be doing a variety of things. You need to have that bigger picture understanding, but you also need to be working day to day, doing the analysis, the analytical stuff as well, working with your team, having empathy. So it's that traversing from strategy to operations and back again, and building that connection. That is where an MBA, I think, and as illustrated by our alumni here tonight, helps you build that skill set, that mindset, and that muscle for being more strategic. And I think that's key. So that's where you can help to position yourself as we come through COVID. It helps you just to inform your communication, number one. So that question about leadership skills that Steve, you handled, you know, I think for me, it's communication that is so critical. And as you can see tonight with our alumni, clear communicators, relatable, able to present each of your experiences and make sense of it for me anyway, and I'm sure for others here in terms of your own particular industries and organizations. So communication is key there. Clarity is another key thing. And an MBA helps you work through the complexity of your operating environment to get to the clarity and the simplicity on the other side. You don't get there straight away. You need to work through that and use the various tools and models that you'll get exposure to in the MBA. So when you come to that position and role of leadership, you're able to tell a good story that's compelling and persuasive, and that people around you can make sense of and are enthused by. And I think that for me is the key role of the MBA. Olivia, back to you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Now I'm just going to do one last question. So, Kristen, I know you're a recent graduate of the MBA, but Clint and Steve Schofield, obviously quite a few years on from when you last completed a degree. How do you feel like it's helped you, get to where you are now? I know you've touched on this a little bit, but do you still feel like it's relevant in your career, some of the things that you've learned now?
That one's to me, Olivia.
Yeah, you can start us off with that one.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut across the other two. Look, I was sharing some of my experience recently with some folks, and when I applied for the MBA back in the mid-90s, a sponsor and a close mentor indicated that often the content of the MBA may only be sort of relevant for 12 months, but it's the, to your point, Steve Janes, it's that strategic challenge around constructing ideas and processes. It's that almost that lean methodology to the way you bring concepts and you sort of build on ideas, and to your point, Kristen, sort of think from different perspectives to create scenarios as opposed to establish the answer. And I think allowing yourself to initiate and commence those strategic processes, put them into action, and then give yourself sufficient bandwidth to test and correct and to sort of reorient your thinking as well as your direction helps. Now, that's a lot of words, but for me, the MBA, importantly, when I started the MBA, I was absolutely anxious as to whether or not I was going to be able to get through. I wasn't sure if I had the intellectual bandwidth or the ability to engage with what were a bunch of very highly accomplished individuals looking to sort of make an incremental step change from very senior roles to an even more senior role. So for me, it was very confronting. But the MGSM, the lecturers, the team at the MGSM at the time, they settled a lot of those things for all of us very early, and they made those corrections for all of us to make that work. And so for me, whilst the content, you know, some of the success stories when I was doing the MBA were stories that had failed 5 years later, following it through the press. So as I say, some of that content can be short-lived, but the process has been very enduring. So for me, I still reflect on the people. I'm still connected with the alumni, and I'm still sort of working through and staying connected from a work perspective to those concepts I was introduced to nearly 30 years ago.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. I actually am going to wrap up those questions now. So thank you all so much, participants, for sending them in, and our panelists for answering them. If you did have any questions that you didn't get to ask today, or you didn't get answered, you can book in for a one-on-one phone consultation currently at the moment to, you know, discuss with someone from the Macquarie Business School more about our postgraduate courses. So you can visit that link there, or you can also scan the QR code. I'll just leave that up for about 30 seconds if anyone's interested in doing that. Okay. And then alternatively, we've also got the Postgraduate Exploration Week coming up in May. So this is a great opportunity for you all to learn more about the different postgraduate courses we have on offer. You can have a chat to some of our academics online and also hear from a wide range of industry experts. So if you're interested in finding out more information about the Postgraduate Exploration Week, please feel free to scan that QR code now. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much to all our panelists today for taking time out of your day and sharing some of your insights. It's been so valuable for me, and I hope the rest of the participants as well. And thank you everyone for dialing in from home, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.
Good job, Olivia. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia.
Thanks, Steve. Kristen.
See you, Steve.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.